The metallic clang of the master lock echoed down the empty corridor of Block C, signaling the start of another day. Officer Clara Miller stepped inside, the fluorescent lights above buzzing in an almost mournful chorus. She ran a hand over her neatly tied bun, adjusting the brim of her cap before beginning her routine. A quiet hum, barely audible above the constant low thrum of the building's ventilation system, escaped her lips. A cheerful folk tune that felt strangely out of place in the stark, concrete environment. Clara moved with a practiced rhythm, her boots squeaking softly against the polished linoleum. Her gaze swept over the cell doors, each one a solid slab of steel with a small, reinforced window. She paused at the first cell, peering inside. The inmate, a new transfer, was still asleep, a blanket pulled up to his chin. Clara made a mental note. No issues there. She continued her patrol, her breath fogging slightly in the cool morning air. The air itself carried the faint, mingled scents of stale coffee, industrial cleaning solution, and an undefinable metallic tang. Jax sat on his bunk, unmoving, a statue carved from the dim light filtering through his cell window. He had been awake for hours, as he usually was, watching the subtle shifts in the prison's rhythm. The previous night had been unsettled, a low current of tension running beneath the usual hum of voices and distant clangs. He hadn't been able to pinpoint the source, only felt its ripple. Jax didn't miss much. His eyes, the color of wet slate, absorbed every detail. The way the light hit the grimy floor, the faint scorch mark on the ceiling from a forgotten incident, the slight tremor in the vent fan in the corner. He even registered the subtle change in the pitch of the morning hum, a higher, more stressed note than usual. He watched Clara through the narrow slit of his cell door, her figure a familiar silhouette against the dim corridor. She was new enough to still hum, new enough to still believe in the quiet mornings. He'd seen her type before, earnest, a little soft around the edges, but with an underlying steel that surprised people. She took her job seriously. He'd give her that. She checked the locks with a diligent precision, a small, almost imperceptible twitch of her wrist confirming each one was secure. Clara reached the middle of the corridor, the faint melody still on her lips. She paused, running her hand along the cool metal of cell 17, a habit she'd picked up from an older officer who swore it helped detect tampering. Nothing. Just the familiar cold steel. She leaned in, her ear close to the door, listening for any sounds of distress or unusual activity. The silence was profound, almost unnatural. Usually by this time, there would be a few groans, a cough, maybe the rustle of a sheet. Today, nothing. Even the ventilation system seemed to have quieted its usual drone. A prickle of unease started to spread across her skin. Her hand instinctively went to her sidearm, a small, reassuring weight against her hip. She chided herself internally. It's just early, Clara. Everyone's still asleep. But the thought felt thin, unconvincing. Her eyes scanned the length of the corridor again, searching for anything amiss. The shadows seemed deeper today, clinging to the corners and crevices with a palpable density. Jax's gaze sharpened. He had been tracking the movements, or lack thereof, from the cells further down. He knew the habits of most men in Block C. Rivera in 22 was an early riser, always tapping out a rhythm on his bunk frame. Mendez in 25 always cleared his throat 3 times before fully waking. Both were silent. More than silent, they were unnaturally still. His eyes narrowed, focusing on the dark patch near the end of the corridor, where the utility closet was. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness deeper than the ambient shadows. It shouldn't be. He remembered seeing it securely latched the previous evening during the final rounds, He held his breath, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He saw Clara's posture stiffen, her head cocking slightly, as if she too had picked up on the strange quiet. She was about to move forward, to continue her patrol, to walk into that patch of deeper shadow. Jax felt a surge of adrenaline, a raw, instinctual warning. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that something was waiting for her there. He had to act. But how? Any sound, any sudden movement from him would alert whatever was lurking. And if they knew he had seen them... Clara took another step, her boot almost reaching the boundary of the unlit area. Her hum died on her lips. The air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken threat. She could almost feel eyes on her, not from the cells she had just passed, but from somewhere ahead. Jax made his decision. He couldn't speak, couldn't yell. He needed to make her stop, without drawing attention to himself or to her. His eyes darted around his cell, searching for something, anything. His gaze landed on the small, chipped ceramic mug he used for coffee. It was heavy, solid. He picked it up, his fingers tightening around the handle. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was a risk, a monumental breaking of protocol, a direct invitation for trouble. But the image of Clara, so earnest and oblivious, walking into that ambush, solidified his resolve. He had to be precise, subtle yet urgent. He couldn't let it look like a warning from an inmate. He had to make it look like an accident. He took a deep breath, focusing all his energy, all his years of suppressed emotion, into this one desperate act. He would throw the mug, not at the wall, not at the door, but at the very edge of the floor, just enough to catch her attention, to make her pause, to look down. And then he would try to convey the rest with his eyes. Unease in the air. The clatter of the ceramic mug against the polished concrete floor echoed through the usually boisterous cell block, a sound that, in its stark suddenness, was deafening. Jax, leaning against the cool steel of his bunk, watched the ripples of that sound spread, not through the air, but through the unnatural stillness that had settled over Block C. It wasn't just the silence, a rare enough commodity in this place, but the quality of it. A deep, heavy quiet, like the air before a storm, pressing down on everything. Even the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light filtering through the high, barred windows. His gaze, usually placid, darted from the fallen mug to the utility closet door. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible where the latch should have been secured. An oddity, he thought, especially given the meticulous nature of the morning rounds. Something was off. He felt it in the prickling sensation on his skin, a faint tremor that wasn't his own, but seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the block. He'd always possessed an almost preternatural awareness of his surroundings, a survival instinct honed over years of navigating the unspoken rules and hidden dangers of this concrete labyrinth. It wasn't about looking for trouble, but about sensing its approach, like an animal detecting a shift in the wind. And the wind, he realized, was changing. His eyes, sharp and quick, swept across the common area, past the empty recreation tables and the stoic faces of the other inmates in their cells. Most were engrossed in their own thoughts or feigning sleep, but a few, he noticed, held a similar tension in their postures, a quiet vigilance that mirrored his own. They felt it too. The air was thick with it, a strange, electric current that spoke of impending disruption. Then he saw them, tucked away near the mop closet, half obscured by a stack of cleaning supplies usually stored elsewhere, were two figures. Diablo, a hulking enforcer from the Serpents, and Razor, a lean, wiry member of the Iron Skulls. Two rival gang members, notorious for their mutual animosity, now huddled together, their heads bent in what appeared to be hushed conversation. Jax's brow furrowed almost imperceptibly. This was more than just unusual. It was an anomaly that screamed danger. Diablo and Razor wouldn't be caught dead in the same breathable air, let alone whispering conspiratorially. Their gangs had a long-standing blood feud, a history of shivs and shakedowns that rarely allowed for even a truce, let alone a clandestine meeting. He watched them, unblinking, from the shadow of his cell, his posture relaxed, but every nerve ending taut. Their movements were furtive, their glances quick and darting, betraying a shared secret. Diablo, usually loud and boisterous, was subdued, his broad shoulders hunched. Razor, typically fidgety and prone to nervous tics, was unnaturally still, his focus entirely on Diablo's low murmurs. Whatever they were discussing, it was weighty, illicit, and deeply out of character. A slow, cold knot began to form in Jax's stomach. This wasn't a casual chat about contraband or a territorial dispute. This felt different, heavier, laced with a predatory intent he recognized all too well. The silence that had initially heralded something strange now felt like a shroud, muffling their whispers, making them seem even more conspiratorial. He tracked their eyes, noting how they kept flickering towards the main corridor, the one Clara Miller would patrol. He'd seen her pass by just moments before, her footsteps light, her silhouette momentarily blocking the fluorescent lights. The thought that she might be the target sent a jolt through him, sharp and unwelcome. Clara was tough, but fair, a rare breed in this place. She didn't deserve whatever these two predators were cooking up. The pieces began to click into place with an unsettling clarity. The unnatural quiet, the open closet door, the rival gang members conspiring. It painted a picture of a meticulously planned ambush, a trap laid with chilling precision. He couldn't hear their words, but their body language spoke volumes. The tension radiating from them was palpable, a dark energy that seemed to thicken the already heavy air. He knew he had to do something. The ceramic mug had been a reflex, an attempt to break the oppressive silence, to disrupt the current of unease. But it wasn't enough. This situation called for more than just a diversion. It called for intervention, a direct signal to the unsuspecting officer that danger lurked in the shadows. He had to warn her, without drawing attention to himself, without letting the conspirators know he was onto them. The stakes, he realized, were suddenly much higher than just another day in Block C. The glint of danger, the clatter of the fallen mug had died, swallowed by the oppressive silence that now clung to Block C like a shroud. Officer Miller, her footsteps a soft rhythm against the concrete, continued her rounds, oblivious to the shift in the air, to the predatory stillness that had descended. Her gaze swept over the cell doors, a practiced, methodical scan, but her mind seemed elsewhere. Perhaps on the paperwork that awaited her, or the endless list of minor infractions that needed addressing. She moved with a certain grace, a quiet dignity that made her seem almost out of place in the grimy, unforgiving confines of the block. Jax, pressed against the rough concrete of his cell wall, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Every instinct screamed at him. The unusual quiet was no accident. It was a deliberate void designed to amplify the ordinary sounds of Miller's approach, to make her predictable. His eyes, keen and unblinking, tracked the two figures near the mop closet. Diablo, a hulking man whose tattoos seemed to writhe on his forearms, leaned against the wall, his posture feigning nonchalance. Razor, leaner and wirier, stood a pace away, his back mostly to Jax, but his head angled subtly towards Diablo. Their murmuring had ceased, replaced by a charged silence that spoke volumes. As Officer Miller's path brought her closer to the utility closet, a mere 10 feet from the mop closet, Jax saw it. Razor's right hand, which had been idly rubbing his thigh, dipped almost imperceptibly into his pocket. The movement was fluid, practiced, and designed to escape casual observation. But Jax wasn't casual. He saw the brief, metallic flash, a sliver of reflected light that pierced the gloom. It was small, no more than 4 or 5 inches, but the glint was unmistakable. The honed edge of a shiv. The improvised blade disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the dark fabric of Razor's jumpsuit. A jolt of raw adrenaline shot through Jax. It wasn't just a threat. It was a clear, undeniable intention. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. This was premeditated. The shiv, the hushed conversation, the calculated positions, it all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. They weren't just planning trouble. They were planning violence. And Officer Miller, with her kind eyes and unsuspecting demeanor, was walking straight into it. Razor pulled his hand out, empty, and then exchanged a swift, loaded glance with Diablo. There was no need for words. The message passed between them, a silent pact of malice. Their eyes, dark and sharp, flickered towards Officer Miller, who was now just a few steps from the utility closet, her back partially turned to them as she checked the seal on a storage bin. She was vulnerable, exposed. The corridor was empty, save for the 3 of them in the silent, watchful cells. No other officers were in sight. The ambush was perfectly orchestrated. Jax's jaw clenched. He was an inmate, a prisoner. His world was one of survival, of keeping his head down, of not attracting attention. Getting involved was a violation of every unwritten rule, every hard-won lesson. It meant exposure, retaliation, an escalation of his own precarious situation. Yet, watching Miller, so close to the precipice, a fierce, protective urge surged through him. She was fair, often too fair for this place. She saw the men, not just the numbers. And now, those men were about to use that very fairness, that trust against her. His mind raced, a whirlwind of desperate options. A shout would alert the conspirators, putting Miller in immediate danger and undoubtedly implicating him. A sudden movement would draw attention, perhaps prematurely triggering their attack. He needed to warn her without revealing his knowledge to them, to signal her without a sound, to convey the urgency of the threat in the most subtle yet unmistakable way. The seconds stretched, each one a drumbeat of increasing tension, as Officer Miller's next step brought her infinitesimally closer to the dark maw of the mop closet, and the glint of danger that lay within. He had to act. A life in the balance. The clinking of Miller's keys, a sound usually so mundane, now echoed in Jax's ears like a death knell. She was rounding the corner of Block C, her stride unhurried, her attention focused on the manifest clipped to her board. The mop closet door was ajar, a sliver of darkness that Jax knew concealed 2 men itching for blood. Diablo, a hulking figure with a tattoo of a snarling wolf on his neck, and Razor, whose eyes always held a predatory gleam, were waiting. The shiv, a sharpened piece of metal glinting faintly in the gloom, was a cold promise of violence. Jax's breath hitched. Time, usually a slow, monotonous crawl within these walls, suddenly accelerated. He could feel the pulse thrumming in his temples, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to stay hidden, to remain invisible, as he always did. This was not his fight. He was a survivor. And survivors didn't intercede in gangland ambushes, especially not when the target was a CO. The consequences for interfering, for even acknowledging such an event, were brutal. Solitary confinement, loss of privileges, a target on his own back. The list was long and terrifying, but then he saw Miller's face, etched with a quiet professionalism. He remembered her small acts of kindness. The extra coffee during a particularly long night shift, the way she listened patiently when an old-timer complained about his bad back. Even the brief, almost imperceptible nod she'd given him once when he'd meticulously cleaned the recreation yard without being asked. She wasn't like some of the others, the ones who reveled in their power, who treated inmates like less than human. Miller saw them. She saw him. A knot tightened in his stomach. He pictured Diablo's sneering face, the glint of the shiv, and the sudden, horrific reality of what was about to happen. Miller was walking into a meat grinder, oblivious. He couldn't just watch. Not this time. The silent code of the prison, the unspoken agreement to see nothing, hear nothing, felt like a choke chain around his throat. It was a choice between his own safety and a woman's life, a life he knew, however peripherally, to be decent. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the metallic tang of fear sharp on his tongue. He had to make a sound, a warning. But what? A shout would alert Diablo and Razor, giving them time to react, to strike before Miller even registered the threat. It would also immediately incriminate him. He needed something subtle, something that would stop her, freeze her in place without giving away the game to the predators in the closet. His eyes darted around, searching for an object, an idea. Nothing. Just the cold concrete walls, the barred windows, the oppressive air. Miller was closer now, her shoes softly scuffing against the polished floor. She was perhaps 10 feet from the mop closet, her gaze still fixed on her clipboard, a faint hum escaping her lips. She was humming a soft, tuneless melody, completely unaware of the darkness awaiting her. Jax's mind raced, a whirlwind of desperation. His gaze fell upon a loose floor tile near his cell door. It was a faint imperfection, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. He could kick it, scrape it, make a noise that was just enough to make her pause, to look up. It would be a small infraction, easily dismissed, but hopefully enough to draw her attention away from her immediate path. He braced himself, his muscles tensing. The seconds stretched, each one feeling like an eternity. Miller was 5 feet away now, her silhouette framed by the corridor's dim light. He could see the faint outline of her duty belt, the keys dangling from her hip. Her hand was reaching for the doorknob of a cell further down the block, preparing for a routine check. Her back would be to the mop closet in another heartbeat. It was now or never. His heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic rhythm. He knew the cost of what he was about to do. He knew the pain, the isolation, the fear that would follow. But as he watched Miller, so close to the precipice of violence, the choice, agonizing as it was, became clear. He would break the rules. He would put himself in harm's way. He would try to save her. He watched her take another step, her footfall light and unsuspecting. The mop closet's shadows deepened, seeming to stretch out like grasping fingers. Diablo and Razor were poised, silent, deadly. The air crackled with a malevolent energy, a silent countdown to an irreversible act. Miller's hand was almost on the doorknob. One more step. Jax's gaze locked onto the loose tile. He coiled his leg, preparing for the movement, the small, deliberate act that would shatter the silence and, hopefully, the ambush. His jaw was clenched, his breath held tight in his chest. The image of the shiv, cold and sharp, flashed in his mind. He had to act. Now. The loud warning. The clatter of the loose tile, a barely perceptible tremor in the concrete, died quickly. Miller, lost in the rhythm of her patrol and the mundane hum of the prison, might have dismissed it as a shift in the building's ancient bones or the distant rumble of laundry carts. Her boot was already lifting for the next step, a step that would take her directly into the shadowed maw of the mop closet, where Diablo and Razor waited, their shiv glinting faintly in the gloom. Jax watched, a knot tightening in his gut. The kick hadn't been enough. It was too subtle, too easily overlooked in the cacophony of the prison. The small, almost imperceptible gesture had failed to pierce the bubble of her routine, the focused efficiency that made her a good officer, but also, in this moment, dangerously oblivious. His mind raced, calculating the odds, the consequences. Informing a guard, actively intervening, was a death sentence in here. It wasn't just a breach of the code. It was an act of betrayal against the unspoken fraternity of the incarcerated. The repercussions would be swift, brutal, and inescapable. Yet the image of Diablo's predatory grin, the cold glint of Razor's eyes, the casual malevolence radiating from them as they prepared their ambush, it churned in him, a foreign and unwelcome sensation. Miller was almost there. One more step. Her hand was reaching for her belt, perhaps to adjust her radio. A small, unconscious gesture. The mop closet door was ajar, a sliver of deeper darkness against the already dim corridor. He could see Diablo's shadow, elongated and menacing, just beyond the frame. A sudden, fierce surge of something akin to outrage, a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed, flared within Jax. It wasn't about heroism. It was about a fundamental sense of right and wrong, a refusal to stand by while a decent person walked into a slaughter. The small kindnesses, the respectful glances, the quiet understanding she'd offered. They coalesced into a silent plea for action. Without thinking, without a conscious decision to break every rule he lived by, Jax balled his right hand into a fist. He didn't just tap or knock. He slammed it with all the force he could muster against the reinforced steel of his cell door. The sound was like a gunshot in the otherwise muted corridor, a sharp, metallic clang that reverberated, echoing off the concrete walls, drowning out the distant drone of the ventilation system, the faint shouts from the yard, the quiet shuffling of other inmates in their cells. It wasn't just loud, it was disruptive, an intrusive, jarring noise that tore through the prison's ambient soundtrack. Officer Miller flinched violently. Her hand, midway to her radio, froze. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise, her body tensing instinctively. The shock of the unexpected deafening sound made her heart leap into her throat. She had been so focused on her route, on the rhythm of her rounds, that the sudden intrusion was deeply disorienting. Her gaze darted around, searching for the source of the abrupt noise, her professional instincts instantly kicking in, assessing for a potential disturbance or a breach. Her eyes landed on Jax's cell. He stood pressed against the bars, his hand still flattened against the steel door, a faint tremor running through him. His face was a mask of careful neutrality, betraying nothing, yet his gaze, usually averted or impassive, was fixed on her with an intensity that made her pause. There was an unspoken urgency in his posture, a silent message in the way his eyes held hers that was far more potent than any spoken word. The momentum of her patrol had been utterly broken. Her foot, poised to step, remained suspended in the air. The mop closet, now just a few feet away, seemed to hum with a new, unsettling silence. The earlier, quiet hum of the prison had been replaced by the lingering echo of the clang, and a sudden, palpable tension that had not been there moments before. Jax's eyes, dark and unreadable, held hers, a silent, powerful anchor in the sudden stillness. For a fleeting second, the entire prison seemed to hold its breath. Silent signals. The clang of Jax's cell door, a jarring explosion in the sudden, unnatural quiet, ripped Miller from her internal monologue. Her hand, midway to her radio, paused. The sound wasn't aggressive, not a frustrated slam, but a deliberate, sharp report. It held an unusual resonance in the hushed corridor, a stark contrast to the usual cacophony of the block. Her eyes, still assessing the quiet, instinctively swiveled towards the source of the noise. Jax stood at his cell door, his face a mask of unusual stillness. Gone was the usual passive indifference, replaced by a focused intensity that snagged Miller's attention. He wasn't looking at her radio, or her in a confrontational way. Instead, his gaze, sharp and unwavering, was fixed on her, and something about it prickled her senses. It wasn't the typical inmate stare, challenging or dismissive. This was different, imbued with an urgent, almost desperate plea. He shook his head, a slow, deliberate movement. Not a casual denial, but a firm, unambiguous signal. His eyes, dark and deep-set, seemed to bore into hers, transmitting a silent command. "Don't move." The unspoken words vibrated in the air between them, a sudden powerful current of warning. Miller, her analytical mind still trying to catch up, felt a chill crawl up her spine. The silence, previously a curiosity, now felt heavy, oppressive, laden with unseen menace. Her hand, still hovering near her radio, dropped slowly to her side. Her instincts, honed by years on the job, screamed at her. This wasn't a game. This wasn't a manipulative ploy. Jax, the quietest, most withdrawn inmate on her block, was communicating an urgency she had never witnessed from him before. His usual self-preservation, his careful neutrality, had been shattered. Then his hand rose. Slowly, deliberately. He extended his palm towards her, a clear, unmistakable stop gesture. His fingers splayed wide, conveying a finality that brooked no argument. His eyes, still locked with hers, flickered briefly, almost imperceptibly, to the right, to the mop closet. Her breath hitched. The image of the mop closet, its door slightly ajar, flashed in her mind. The unusual silence, the lack of movement, the absence of the usual correctional officer who should be mopping at this time. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. Jax's signals, so subtle yet so potent, were painting a terrifying picture. Danger, imminent, from the closet. A cold wave washed over her, replacing the initial confusion with a surge of adrenaline. Her body tensed, every muscle coiling. She froze, a statue in the middle of the corridor, her heart hammering against her ribs. The faint, metallic scent of disinfectant from the mop closet suddenly seemed menacing, a cover for something far more sinister. She didn't move a single muscle, didn't dare to breathe too deeply. Her gaze remained fixed on Jax, a silent question in her eyes. He held her stare, a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. Relief? Grim determination? Passing through his dark gaze. His hand remained outstretched, a silent sentinel, directing her attention to the threat she had almost walked into. The air thickened, charged with the unspoken communication between them. A lifeline forged in a moment of extreme peril. The weight of the silence pressed down, amplifying the frantic thrum of her pulse in her ears. She could almost feel the unseen eyes watching her, waiting for her to make a move. But she wouldn't. Not yet. Not until Jax gave her another signal. Her life, she realized with a jolt, was now in the hands of an inmate. The corridor stretched out, an expanse of polished concrete and steel, suddenly transformed into a minefield. The muted buzz of the fluorescent lights above seemed to hum a dirge. Miller's mind raced, piecing together the fragmented clues. The missing mop crew, the strange quiet. Now Jax's urgent, wordless warnings. This wasn't a simple inmate squabble or a distraction. This was planned. A calculated ambush. The realization sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. She was a target. Jax, still as a stone, slowly lowered his hand, but his eyes never left hers. His expression remained unreadable, but the intensity in his gaze was a stark, unwavering beacon. He had done his part. The warning was delivered. Now, it was up to her. The weight of his silent communication settled upon her, a heavy mantle of responsibility and a strange, unexpected sense of gratitude. She had to understand, had to react, not just for herself, but for the silent protector who had risked everything to warn her. Every fiber of her being screamed to pull her weapon, to radio for backup, to move. But Jax's initial shake of the head, his stop gesture, his pointed glance at the closet, held her captive. She forced herself to remain still, to control the tremor that threatened to run through her limbs. She trusted him, an inmate, a man she barely knew. But in this moment, his silent signals were clearer, more honest than any words. The ambush foiled. The sharp clang of Jax's cell door echoed, a sound usually absorbed by the prison's constant hum, but now it cut through the unnatural quiet like a gunshot. It wasn't just noise. It was an announcement, a deliberate disruption that rippled through the sterile air. The two figures lurking near the mop closet, their shadows stretching long and distorted in the fluorescent light, stiffened. Their carefully cultivated air of nonchalance evaporated, replaced by a flicker of confusion and then recognition. Their eyes, dark and narrowed, snapped towards Jax's cell. Jax, leaning casually against the bars, met their gaze with an impassive stare. No challenge, no smirk, just an unwavering, almost bored assessment. Yet, beneath that placid surface, a subtle tension coiled. He knew the message had landed. He knew the intent behind his actions had been understood. The rivals, members of the Serpent's gang, a group whose venomous reputation preceded them, knew their window of opportunity had slammed shut. The element of surprise, their most potent weapon, was gone. Officer Miller, frozen mid-stride, felt the shift in the atmosphere. The thick, oppressive silence that had been building around her now fractured, replaced by a different kind of tension. One of thwarted aggression. She watched the two inmates near the closet, their postures no longer predatory, but suddenly awkward, almost sheepish. One, a burly man named Rico, with a jagged scar bisecting his eyebrow, muttered something under his breath to his companion, a wirier man with darting eyes. Their clandestine meeting near the mop closet, a common blind spot, suddenly seemed ludicrously exposed. The air thrummed with unspoken accusations. The serpents looked at Jax, a silent question passing between them. Why? Why would he, the solitary, unaligned inmate, interfere? Jax offered no explanation, his expression a carefully constructed mask of indifference. He simply held their gaze, a silent testament to his unyielding will. The message was clear. This was not a mistake. This was a choice. Rico, his face a canvas of barely suppressed fury, finally broke eye contact with Jax. He shot a quick, furtive glance at Miller, then back at his partner. The moment of decision hung heavy, thick as the prison's stale air. Their plan, whatever it had been, was compromised. The warning, subtle as it was, had been effective. Miller was no longer an oblivious target. She was an aware officer, her senses on high alert, even if she didn't fully grasp the extent of the danger she'd just avoided. With a barely perceptible shrug that was meant to convey nonchalance but instead broadcasted irritation, Rico pushed off the wall. "Come on," he grunted, his voice a low rumble. "Guards got her eyes on us." His companion, whose name Miller couldn't recall, fell into step beside him. They began to walk, not quickly, not suspiciously, but with a deliberate, almost exaggerated slowness. Their hands remained visible, their expressions carefully blank. They moved down the corridor, past Jax's cell, past Miller, feigning an indifference that was betrayed by the stiffness in their shoulders and the slight clench of their jaws. Miller watched them go, her heart thudding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The rhythmic click of their shoes on the polished concrete grew fainter as they rounded the corner and disappeared from view. Only then did she allow herself to breathe, a long, shaky exhalation that fogged the air in front of her. The initial shock began to recede, leaving a cold, hard knot of fear in its wake. She had been seconds, perhaps even less, from walking into something terrible. The implications of Jax's warning, of his deliberate intervention, were beginning to sink in. Her eyes, still wide with adrenaline, found Jax's again. He was no longer leaning against his cell door. He was sitting on his bunk, his back to the bars, staring blankly at the opposite wall. The brief, intense connection they had shared moments ago was severed. He was once again the withdrawn, unreadable inmate, a ghost in his own cell. But Miller knew better now. She had seen the flicker of something profound in his eyes, a silent plea that had saved her life. The prison, which had always felt like a series of predictable routines, had just revealed a hidden layer of complexity, a silent language spoken in clangs and glances, a world where an inmate's quiet act of defiance could mean the difference between life and death. The air, though still, now hummed with a different kind of energy, a lingering echo of danger and an unexpected, wordless act of courage. The footage tells all. The fluorescent lights of Chief Warden Thompson's office hummed, casting a sterile glow on the monitor displaying the previous day's corridor footage. Thompson, a man whose stern demeanor was etched deep by years of prison politics and crises, leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the screen. The clock in the top left corner read 14:37. He watched Officer Miller's figure approach the blind corner, her stride even, oblivious. Then, the camera's perspective shifted slightly, revealing a partial view into the mop closet. Two dark shapes, barely discernible in the dimness, moved within. Rico, no doubt. Thompson's brow furrowed. He'd reviewed Miller's incident report, a concise recounting of an averted ambush, but the written word often missed the visceral truth. The video, however, was unforgivingly clear. The two figures in the closet seemed to tense, their movements subtle but purposeful, like predators scenting prey. Miller was just moments away. Then the frame widened slightly, to include the cell block opposite. Cell 217, Jax. Thompson recognized the inmate instantly, a silent, almost invisible presence on his yard for years. Jax sat on his bunk, facing the corridor, his posture rigid. As Miller drew closer, Jax's head tilted almost imperceptibly, his eyes fixed on the mop closet. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Not fear, but a cold, calculating assessment. Thompson watched, mesmerized, as Jax's right hand, previously resting on his knee, began to rise. Slowly, deliberately, it connected with the steel door of his cell, producing a sharp, metallic clang that echoed through the otherwise silent corridor. The sound was stark, out of place, a disruption in the prison's monotonous rhythm. On screen, Officer Miller flinched, her hand instinctively going to her sidearm. Her head snapped towards Jax's cell. She saw him. And then she saw the closet. The two figures inside recoiled, their ambush shattered by the unexpected noise. They exchanged frantic glances, then melted back into the shadows of the closet, before quickly emerging and retreating down the opposite corridor, their hurried steps betraying their frustration. Miller, now fully alert, stood her ground, her gaze sweeping the empty corridor. She looked back at Jax. He met her stare, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, nodded. It was a single, curt movement, a silent confirmation of the danger she had just evaded. Thompson felt a jolt of understanding. Jax hadn't just made noise. He had delivered a message, a warning. The chief warden replayed the sequence, slowing it down. He focused on Jax's eyes, the way they tracked the men in the closet, the precise timing of the clang. It wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate, calculated act, a protective act. Thompson leaned back, a complex mix of surprise and grudging respect coloring his features. Jax, the quiet survivor, had broken the inmate code of silence, not for personal gain, but to save an officer. He picked up his desk phone, the plastic cool against his ear. "Sergeant Davis, please send Officer Miller to my office, and have Jax from cell 217 escorted here. Immediately." His voice was firm, leaving no room for questions. A few minutes later, Officer Miller stood before Thompson's imposing desk, her posture straight, a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. She had reviewed the footage herself, the cold confirmation of the danger she'd faced making her stomach clench. The casual disregard for her life, the calculated cruelty of it, still shook her. She understood now, with chilling clarity, the depth of Jax's intervention. The door opened again, and Jax was escorted in by two burly guards. He walked with his usual unhurried pace, his hands cuffed behind his back, his face a mask of placid indifference. He didn't look at Miller, didn't acknowledge the guards, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the chief warden's head. Thompson gestured to the empty chair in front of his desk. Jax sat, his movements economical, his eyes finally settling on Thompson. The chief warden steepled his fingers. "Officer Miller, Jax," he began, his voice devoid of emotion. "We need to talk about what happened yesterday." His gaze flicked from Miller's earnest face to Jax's impassive one. The air in the room thickened, charged with unspoken truths and the weight of an averted tragedy. Unexpected gratitude. The heavy oak door of Chief Thompson's office clicked shut behind Clara, the sound echoing the sudden shift in her reality. Jax sat opposite Thompson, his usual stoic expression betraying nothing of the imminent conversation. The air was thick with an unspoken gravity, the usual hum of the prison corridor, replaced by the rhythmic whir of the chief's desktop fan. "Officer Miller, have a seat," Thompson said, gesturing to the chair beside Jax. Clara settled in, her uniform rustling softly. She glanced at Jax, whose gaze remained fixed on a point just beyond Thompson's shoulder. There was no defiance in his posture, nor any fear, just an unnerving calm. Thompson leaned forward, his hands clasped on the polished surface of his desk. "Jax, let's go over this one more time. The footage is quite clear. You saw Rico and another inmate, T-Bone, hiding in the mop closet. You then deliberately slammed your cell door, a clear breach of protocol, just as Officer Miller was approaching that section of the corridor. Why? Jax finally shifted his gaze, meeting Thompson's eyes with an unblinking intensity. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, devoid of inflection. They were waiting. For her. He paused, then added, to hurt her. Clara felt a chill trace down her spine. The simplicity of his statement, the stark absence of emotion, made the threat all the more real. She remembered the strange silence, the subtle shift in the air, the prickle of unease that had prompted her to pause. It hadn't been an instinct, she now realized, but a warning. "And how did you know?" Thompson pressed. Jax's eyes flickered to Clara for a fraction of a second, then back to the chief. "Heard them talking. Rico. He doesn't like officers, especially not new ones." Clara swallowed, the memory of her initial interactions with Rico flashing through her mind. He'd been sullen, uncooperative, but she dismissed it as typical inmate behavior. She hadn't connected it to a deliberate plot, a planned assault. The naive part of her, that tried to see the best in everyone, felt a sharp sting of betrayal. Not from Jax, but from her own misplaced optimism. "And you decided to warn her," Thompson continued, his tone unreadable, "even though it meant breaking the code, risking reprisal from other inmates?" Jax shrugged slightly. It wasn't right. That simple phrase resonated deeply with Clara. It wasn't right. It was a moral compass in a place often devoid of one. She remembered the small kindnesses she'd extended to Jax, the extra 5 minutes he'd needed for his art supplies, the time she'd patiently listened when he'd reported a faulty light in his cell. Little things, forgotten by her, but clearly remembered by him. Thompson leaned back, a sigh escaping him. "Well, Jax, your actions saved Officer Miller from a serious assault, possibly worse. I'm not sure what the official procedure is for an inmate who saves an officer's life by breaching protocol, but I assure you, it will be taken into account." He then turned to Clara. "Officer Miller, I believe you have something to say." Clara's gaze met Jax's. His eyes, usually so guarded, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. A blend of resignation and perhaps a faint curiosity. She took a deep breath, her voice a little shaky at first, then strengthening. "Jax," she began, I don't even know how to begin to thank you. You put yourself at risk for me. You broke the rules, knowing what that could mean for you, all because you saw something wrong and you acted on it." Her voice thickened with emotion. "You saved my life. I genuinely believe that. If I'd walked into that closet." She trailed off, imagining the scenario, the cold dread making her shiver. Jax simply nodded, a subtle dip of his head that was almost imperceptible. He didn't speak, didn't offer any platitudes, but the slight softening around his eyes was a profound acknowledgement. Clara continued, her voice imbued with a raw sincerity. "I work here every day, and sometimes it's easy to forget that there are still good people, even in the hardest places. You reminded me of that. You showed me a loyalty I never expected, a courage that's truly remarkable." She paused, searching for the right words to convey the depth of her gratitude. "Thank you, Jax. From the bottom of my heart." A flicker of something akin to surprise crossed Jax's face, quickly masked. He maintained his composed silence, but Clara felt a connection had been forged, an invisible thread of understanding between them that transcended the bars and uniforms. Chief Thompson cleared his throat. "All right. Jax, you can return to your cell. We'll be discussing the particulars of Rico and T-Bone's actions, and yours in due course." Jax rose, his movements fluid and quiet. He cast one last glance at Clara, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, before he exited the office. The door closed softly behind him, leaving Clara and Thompson in the quiet aftermath. Clara sat there for a moment, absorbing the weight of what had just transpired. The prison, once a clear-cut landscape of good versus bad, officer versus inmate, now felt infinitely more complex. She'd always prided herself on seeing beyond the uniform or the jumpsuit. But this was a revelation. An inmate, a man society had deemed a criminal, had displayed a moral conviction that many on the outside lacked. He hadn't sought reward, hadn't asked for anything. He had simply acted because it wasn't right. The intricate web of loyalties, fears, and unexpected compassion within these walls was suddenly clearer, sharper. Her job had always been about maintaining order, but now she understood it was also about navigating a hidden moral landscape, one where heroes could emerge from the most unlikely places, and trust could be found in the most unexpected hearts. The uniform she wore suddenly felt heavier, imbued with a new layer of responsibility and a profound, unexpected gratitude. Beyond the bars, a week later, the mess hall buzzed with a dull roar of conversation. Jack settled at his usual table, a plate of lukewarm, unidentifiable meat and pallid green beans before him. He listlessly pushed his food around, his gaze snagging on the far wall where a flickering television replayed grainy sports highlights. A shadow fell across his table. He looked up, meeting Officer Miller's eyes. She offered a fleeting, almost imperceptible nod, her expression a carefully guarded mask. "Jax, Chief Thompson wants to see you," she said, her voice a quiet current in the din. He shoved his plate away, a leaden knot forming in his gut. He hadn't been summoned to the chief's office since the incident. He trailed Miller through the labyrinth of tables, acutely aware of the inmates' watchful eyes, their curiosity a palpable wave. The guards at the administrative wing's entrance gave him an extra lingering look, a blend of suspicion and a flicker of grudging respect. The air around him seemed to thicken, less overtly hostile, more charged. Inside Chief Thompson's office, the chief sat behind his formidable oak desk, a neat stack of reports the only ornamentation. Miller stood by the door, her posture rigidly attentive. Thompson gestured to the empty chair facing him. Jax sat back straight, hands resting on his knees. "Jax," Thompson began, his voice surprisingly devoid of its usual gravelly edge, "we appreciate what you did for Officer Miller." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "That wasn't just a warning. You risked yourself." Jax remained silent, his gaze steady. He neither sought nor expected commendation. He'd merely acted on an impulse, a nascent spark within him that recoiled from the blatant injustice he witnessed. Thompson slid a small, hardcover book across the desk. It was an old edition of The Call of the Wild. The cover was well worn, corners dog-eared, yet the title gleamed in the subdued office light. "A small token of our appreciation," Thompson offered. "I hear you like to read." Jax's eyes widened almost imperceptibly as he reached for the book. He traced his thumb over the embossed title, a faint, unfamiliar smile touching his lips. It had been years since he'd held a physical book. Years since he'd read anything beyond the meager prison library selections. This was different. This was his. "Thank you, Chief," Jax rumbled, the most he'd spoken in weeks. Thompson nodded, a faint flicker of approval in his eyes. "You're dismissed, Jax." As Jax rose, clutching the book, he met Officer Miller's gaze. Her eyes held a warmth that cut through the sterile confines of the office, a silent understanding passing between them. It was a bond forged not through words, but through shared experience, an act of selfless courage that had resonated deep within her. Back in the cell block, the atmosphere around Jax had subtly transformed. The other guards, typically impassive, now offered curt nods, a newfound deference in their eyes. Officer Peterson, known for his unyielding sternness, even offered a gruff, "Good job, Jax." For Peterson, it was a profound declaration. This shift was almost palpable, a silent acknowledgement of his actions. He was no longer merely another inmate. He was the inmate who had saved one of their own. Later that evening, after the clang of dinner trays subsided, and the dim glow of the cell block lights cast elongated shadows, Jax sat on his cot, lost in the pages of The Call of the Wild. The words transported him. Vivid descriptions of snow-covered landscapes and primal instincts echoing a wildness rarely encountered within these walls. He traced the lines of text with a calloused finger, the scent of old paper and ink a comforting balm. Officer Miller passed his cell during her rounds, her footsteps soft on the concrete. She paused just outside, her eyes falling upon the book in his hands. A subtle smile touched her lips, a quiet understanding passing between them. There was no need for words, no need for elaborate gestures. The book, a simple gift, spoke volumes. It was a bridge between their worlds, a testament to the unexpected connection that had bloomed from a moment of peril. She continued her rounds, her presence a silent assurance. Jax looked up from his book, watching her receding figure until she disappeared around the corner. He knew then that things had changed. He wasn't just a number, not just a problem to be managed. To Officer Miller, he was a human being who had made a choice that had saved her life. And in that quiet understanding, a new kind of trust had begun to take root, a trust that transcended the cold steel of the bars and the stark realities of their respective roles. He returned to his book, the story of survival and instinct, mirroring, in its own way, the unexpected turns his own life had taken within these walls. The silence of the cell block was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet hum of a nascent bond, a testament to the enduring power of a single act of kindness.